plant a tree, save the planet. Hey everyone, welcome back to Do What You Can for the People, the show that nobody asked for. I'm your host, Nicole, and I'm here today with Dan LINSKY. Dan is the Vice President of Voluntary Markets and the leader of the transaction team at CLIMECO. He oversees all voluntary carbon sales, coordinates strategies, and manages CLIMECO's carbon offset inventories for this growing market. Through market education and planning initiatives, he helps companies align carbon offset use with their sustainability goals. He works with corporations, organizations, and events to offset their greenhouse gas emissions. Hi, Dan. Thanks so much for being on the show today.
Hey, Nicole. It's great to be here. Thanks.
Really excited to have you on the show to talk about carbon offsets and all of these things, because I think this conversation is really important, especially right now in non-COVID times. This is right around the time when we'd all be planning our road trips or buying plane tickets or train tickets to go for the holidays. And I think something that a lot of people forget is that it's one of the highest times for carbon emissions, especially related to transportation. So according to the EPA in 2018, 28% of all greenhouse gas emissions in our country came from transportation, which I think is a really big number. And I'd love to hear if you have anything you want to add on that.
I know, especially when you talk about consumers and where do their emissions come from. I mean, it's really their energy use in their home and transportation, whether that's driving or flights or what have you.
Yeah, and I think that a lot of us forget just what a big impact it has. Almost all of our fuel is petroleum based in this country, especially when you talk about planes and trains. The technology I don't think is there yet where we could start thinking about renewable energy sources or solar.
Right. No, that's right. You did see probably, though, California just signed a law that by 2035, all vehicles will be zero emission vehicles, which is pretty aggressive.
Yeah, that would be great to see. I'm looking forward to that.
Yeah.
I did a little digging and I found out that the average annual carbon footprint of a US resident is approximately 17.5 metric tons. And there are ways to offset that. And I know that you have a little bit of information on that on an individual level, kind of what that cost looks like.
Yeah, so, we deal with a lot of really big corporations, right? And some of these corporations buy hundreds of thousands of tons of offsets per year, some even millions. When you get down to the consumer level, it's just as important because, hey, if you emit 17 tons per year, if you're responsible for that, then that's your part. There's no reason for you to worry about 100,000 tons, right? But you should do your part for your 17 tons. So unfortunately, it's kind of tough to get the really less expensive prices that big corporations get when they're buying 1 million tons, which is understandable. But usually somewhere between $8 to $12 a ton, which really isn't bad for 20 tons. You're talking a couple $100 to offset your emissions for the year. If you can do it, it's great. Even if you can do half or a quarter, a lot of corporations have goals to reduce their emissions by 25% by a certain date. There's no reason why anybody should be shamed if they're reducing 25% of their emissions by offsetting. It's a great thing. It's a good start.
Yeah, I completely agree. And the reason I wanted to highlight that number is because I feel like a lot of people are intimidated. How the hell could I possibly offset my carbon emissions? I don't have thousands of dollars at my disposal. I mean, if we're talking about the average US citizen, $240 I think is a lot more attainable than a lot of people would imagine.
It's a great point. And even towards the end of the year, people gift that, right?
Yes.
If you know somebody who's a real tree hugger or really concerned about the environment, it's a great gift to say, hey, I'm going to offset your emissions for the year. That's a really heartfelt gift.
Yeah, anyone who's watching and wants to offset my emissions, by all means do.
Hey, I'll tell you what, we will do that for you.
Oh, that's so kind of you.
All right.
Maybe let's back up and let's unpack for the people what carbon offsets are, and if you could explain what carbon offsets are and how it's different from a carbon tax, that would be great.
It's a great point, because there's always been that debate: do we let the market figure out how to reduce emissions, or do we just tax carbon and force the corporations to reduce their emissions that way? So carbon offsets are simply doing projects that reduce carbon emissions and then offering those reductions to people or corporations who want to offset their emissions. Because the thing about carbon is it doesn't matter where in the world it's emitted, it has the same negative effect on climate change. By the same token, though, wherever it's reduced, it also has the same positive effect. So if you're a big corporation, you don't have to reduce on site. It's great if you can, you should reduce everything you can. But if you decide to support a project in Alaska, it has the same positive effect as if you supported a project right at your plant. The idea is to reduce the number of emissions going up. And secondly, if you could reduce it cheaper on a project, but it has the same positive effect, why wouldn't you?
Yeah.
You know, there's no reason to spend $50 a ton reducing it in-house if you can spend $8 a ton reducing it somewhere else and have the same exact effect on climate change.
That's a great point.
Yeah.
I think that's a great point. Go ahead.
Well, the carbon tax
Yeah.
is simply the government saying we're going to tax carbon, right? So if you're emitting carbon at a certain level, then you would be taxed, let's say, $100 a ton or whatever it might be, depending on. The only issue we have with that is if you're a really wealthy corporation, then you just pay the tax and nothing gets reduced, right? Mm-hmm. With offsets, you either reduce at your site and you don't have to buy offsets, or you purchase offsets from emission reduction projects. So emissions are being reduced. But with that carbon tax, $100 a ton, here's my $500,000, see you next year, you know? Yeah. And the government says that they'll use that. Normally, governments that have carbon taxes say that they will use that money for technologies that reduce emission or renewable energy technologies. Sometimes they do. I just read an article just this past week, and I forget which country it is, I'm sorry, but where they found out that they didn't, it just went into the coffers. So there's no guarantee of reductions in the carbon tax like there is with offsets.
Yeah, that's a really good point about, at least with buying offsets, there's a sense of knowing where your money's going and accountability. And I think one of my favorite things from what you were just talking about is it's a sense of collective impact. When we're talking about the environment, it's one of the few spaces where we're not bound by country borders. What happens in my country will absolutely affect your country and vice versa.
That's right. And there's really a lot of countries that don't have places they could do big offset projects, but some of those are in the most trouble for climate change.
Absolutely. I think that's a really important conversation that we're seeing happening right now around the environmental justice movement. So this offsets are a great way to support that.
Yeah, good point.
So I know that CLIMECO works in a few different ways. One is in the voluntary carbon sale market and the other is in the regulated market. Can you explain the difference there?
Sure. So in California, just keeping it in the United States, in California, they're regulated for carbon. So if you emit over a certain amount of carbon per year, then you're regulated on that. So the government will will auction off what they call allowances, and each allowance allows you to emit 1 metric ton of carbon, right? And so if you're capped at 1 million tons, let's say, and you only emit 800,000 tons, then you have 200,000 tons left over. You could sell those to another company, right? Who may be over. Mm-hmm. Or in California, you can also purchase offsets for a certain percentage of your regulated commitment. And those offsets usually sell at a little bit less than the government allowance because the allowance is, given out by the government. There's no questions. The offset, they have to check into the project, make sure it's all right, make sure that there was no problems and all that. So that market, you have to reduce, right? In the voluntary market, you're doing it most likely because you think it's the right thing to do. Most of the larger corporations that I sell to are doing it voluntarily because they feel it's the right thing to do. They emit X amount of tons per year, and they feel like they should amend for that. So they buy offsets in the areas that they can't reduce on their own. So the same thing applies kind of to individuals, right? They're not regulated. Nobody's regulated right now for carbon. I don't see that ever happening. But you can, on your own, if you feel it's the right thing to do. When you start your car in the morning, if you don't have an electric vehicle, you know that carbon dioxide is pumping out that tailpipe. You don't have to do anything about it, but think about what it would cost for you to put in technology in your car to abate those 5-6 tons per year that comes out of your tailpipe. Really expensive, not worth, I mean, nobody would ever do it, but for, $40, you can reduce that same amount on a project elsewhere.
Absolutely. A few other examples that I think of when I think of the voluntary carbon sale at an individual level, or I believe United Airlines has an option where you can like add I think it's like $40 and they'll offset the emissions of your flight. So there are options out there and I'd love to see them advertised more. And I hope that's coming.
It is. In fact, American Airlines just set up a program with one of our favorite kind of consumer sites called Cool Effect.
Okay.
So they have a landing page now where you can offset your flights. They'll calculate it for you. You land on the Cool Effects page and you can pay to offset that amount. And it's much less than $40 because you're only offsetting your portion of those 200 seats or whatever on the flight.
Yeah. Great. I'll definitely include a link in the description box of this video for people who want to check that out.
Yeah.
We'd love to hear what you think some of the common pitfalls are that people should avoid, whether it's at the individual level or the organizational level when they're considering carbon offsets.
It's a really good question. What you want to make sure you do is that purchase offsets from a credible carbon registry. Or from a company that has their projects listed at one of the credible project registries. So for the voluntary market, that's mostly the Climate Action Reserve, the American Carbon Registry, or Vera, or the Gold Standard. And all of those registries go through a rigorous third-party verification of all the projects and even the data and how many offsets were issued for that project over a certain time period. You can read, all the reports are publicly posted online at the sites. You can read those reports. They get very detailed. They talk about the additionality, right? This wouldn't happen without the carbon market, this project. Talks about if there's any leakage. In other words, okay, we're not going to cut down this forest anymore, but by the way, we're just going to move over and cut the forest down next to it, right? That's leakage. So the project wouldn't be good if that's the case. So if you purchase offsets and ask the question, what registry is this listed on? If it's a credible registry, they've done most of the work involved in making sure that the offset is real. It's a real reduction in carbon. But secondly, you want to, kind of like insurance, you can buy term insurance or you can buy whole life, right? And so are you buying insurance to pay for, an event that happens or are you buying insurance because of all the other things, right? The investments and all that. If you want to buy offsets to reduce a ton of carbon, then it's okay to buy the least expensive offset you can find. Why wouldn't you, right? Mm-hmm. But if you want to say, I want to reduce my carbon footprint, but I also want to make sure like it's a type of project that I have feeling that I like, right? It's either it's in the US, I want to support US projects, or it's forestry and I hike in the woods all the time. I want to support that. Or it's an industrial type of project because I work at a chemical plant, right? I want to support reductions in my field. So you can actually, on the voluntary market, ask your provider, what type of projects do you have? And, what's the price difference between a forestry project, which is usually more expensive, versus an industrial project? And which one fits you? Which one, you and I aren't wearing the same shirt, right?
Yeah.
We didn't both buy the cheapest shirt just because that fits your personality, right?
Absolutely.
So that's the other question when you're looking for offsets is don't be afraid to ask those about, what the project is and how could it really relate to what I like.
Yeah, I love that. I think also then it makes it less as I'm just going to put money in to offset my impact and more of an investment with actual impact, like a long-term investment that you're making.
Yeah, and you can come back and support that year after year.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's great. I think that's a good segue into the next question that I have for you, which is a lot of these offset programs that we're seeing are focused on protecting forests in Madagascar, Peru, Kenya, and that's definitely important as a critical part of the solution to climate change because those are the forests that are storing the carbon dioxide absorbed from the atmosphere. But what are some more local offset options that we could be considering to see an impact in the communities that we're living in, and also to make sure that we're not disproportionately ruining our communities, but protecting these other communities?
Yeah, it's a great question. So in the US, there's a lot of project types. There's forestry projects right here in the US to support. We're actually working on a forestry project to reforest about 1 million acres, long-term 1 million acres. They're doing it in 5,000 acre chunks right along the Mississippi River. We're partnered with a nonprofit called Restore the Earth. Amazing people. And so that first project will be right at the, in Louisiana near the Gulf of Mexico, places that, hurricanes flooded, and they just really need some help reforesting to help protect those areas, wildlife, and a million other co-benefits that go along with it. But really beautiful project. So right here in the US, you can support that project. There are many, many, many landfill gas projects that you can support. So in other words, you capture the methane from the landfills and convert it to energy and put that energy back in the grid, as opposed to methane going in the atmosphere. Very, very powerful greenhouse gas, right? There's renewable energy projects, wind, solar, that you can support here in the US. We do a lot of industrial projects, right? So we reduce N2O emissions at industrial plants that make fertilizer or specialty plastics. You don't think environmentally. You look at a big industrial plant and say, hey, that's what I want to support for environment, right?
Yeah.
But if those guys voluntarily say, hey, no, we know we're emitting this stuff, we're gonna put in technology to reduce our emissions or destroy them. That's great, right? Because these are the people that you look at and you say they need to do something about that, and they are voluntarily.
Absolutely. I think that's a great point also, because they're really the industry leaders. And if they start, and if they have the support from the people to start, then I feel like it's the first domino tile. Everything else will start to fall into line.
Yeah, some of the biggest emitters are voluntarily reducing that.
Yeah. Great to hear.
And those are expensive projects. They don't do it lightly.
No,
Yeah.
they're definitely expensive projects. Big impact projects have big budgets.
That's right.
So this has been super helpful. I think that it's been very enlightening, even for me. When we started talking about this, I thought that carbon offsets were really just plant a tree, save the planet. So it's really nice to hear about all the incredible ways that you can participate in the offset programs. And I'd love to hear about the work that CLIMECO specifically does and how you guys help in this movement.
Great. So as I just said, the Restore the Earth project is one we're really excited about. I'm actually going to go plant some trees there this fall, so I'm excited. We do a lot of industrial reduction projects where we'll put in technology to capture N2O and break it down into other elements that are okay and don't trap heat. Those are really cool projects. We have a really cool project type where, have you ever bought a refrigerator?
No, not yet.
Not yet.
Not yet.
When you buy a refrigerator and they deliver your refrigerator from Lowe's or Home Depot, they'll take your refrigerator away.
Yeah,
right?
that's true. They do that.
Which is great, because you don't want to have to lug it out to the landfill or something, right? But what they do with that is they send it to recycling centers. They usually get paid a small fee for each fridge they send to the recycling center. So we actually the recycling center strips it and recycles everything, which is really cool. I've read on your website how much you're into reuse, right?
Yeah.
Well, they do that. Imagine that fridge sitting at a landfill versus all the metal being used, all the foam being used, all the plastic being reused, right? But they used to sell the refrigerant back into the market, because there's a market for old refrigerants, because they don't manufacture those anymore. But those refrigerants have a very high global warming potential.
Yes.
So now we pay them a little more to collect that for us. And when they have a certain amount collected, we go and get it. And we bring it to our destruction facility in Ohio, and we incinerate it properly, so that because when you sell it back in the market, they go into old chillers that need the older refrigerants, and those old chillers, a lot of them leak.
Yes.
So we destroy those refrigerants, and we can get carbon offsets for that we can sell, because the refrigerants aren't being leaked back into the atmosphere.
Very cool.
Really cool. And we get from recycling centers all over the country.
Yeah. And so I don't know if you're at liberty to tell us this, but are those kinds of innovative projects, are those specifically with, say, in partnership with a company that sells kitchen appliances or something like that? And how are you pairing opportunities with organizations? And I know I didn't ask you this question in
No,
advance.
but I get it. So yeah, we have agreements with the recycling centers. So there's like I don't run those projects, so I forget the name of the recycling centers, but they're the big ones. I went and visited one once, and so if he's watching, I'm sorry, I forgot the name. But it's almost like a manufacturing site. There's just refrigerators coming down the conveyor belts, just a big line of
Wow.
old ugly green refrigerators and faded yellow refrigerator, these,
Yeah.
and they're just coming down as if they're being manufactured. There's that many of them, and they just go through every process and get stripped. And then those offsets are actually allowed into the California program. So those offsets get sold usually to compliance buyers or regulated buyers in California.
Oh, very cool. That makes a lot of sense. Well, that's really it for my questions. I guess I'll leave it with you, Dan, if you had any closing words for our viewers. Again, thank you so much for your insights today.
Oh, it's been really a lot of fun. A lot of fun. I think the idea is if you know you're emitting, this isn't a guilt trip. If you know you're emitting, that you can do something about it, right? It's like you said, you don't have to be intimidated. We offset bands tours, right? Because when they travel, they emit. So Pearl Jam, Third Eye Blind, we've worked with those guys and help them offset their tours. We've worked with athletes to offset their training and trips. And we've worked with people having weddings. They want to have a carbon neutral wedding, so they'll offset people's flights that are coming in and for the energy use of the hotels and stuff like that. So, and of course, just your everyday starting your car emissions and taking a flight emissions, all that stuff. So it's when you get to the consumer level, it's not really expensive. It's easy to do. We're actually going to launch a site, CLIMECO Green. That'll be more consumer based and event based, as opposed to, we kind of sell a lot to big corporates. So our website's kind of static, but this CLIMECO Green will be geared towards individuals and consumers and events and entertainment industry, so that we can help them calculate their emissions and even give them hints on how they can reduce it and then offset the rest, and even give them hints on other things sustainability wise outside of carbon. We're working with a great company called Earth Up that you could check out, that's building a really cool calculator to kind of give you a whole overview of your sustainability impact beyond not just carbon, but water and all kinds of things. It's really cool.
Absolutely. And if I could just add to that, I think a few steps that people could take right away is, I'll include a link below where you can calculate your carbon footprint right now. I think even just awareness of the impact that you're having on the planet is really important. You can always vote with your dollars. If you can't offset directly, you can always support a company that is participating in the offset market. And I think the third option is, again, if it's not financially feasible for you to offset your own impact, is to volunteer with some of these organizations.
Yeah, that's great. It's a great point. Really, really good point.
All right. Well, that's it from me. Dan, thank you so much.
Hey, thanks for having me, man. It's great to see that smile, man. I wish you success on your shows. I like reading through your website and your content and your passion for it. Really
Thank you so much. And to everyone watching, I'll see you next week.